안녕하세요. 총장입니다. 학생들 추운데 많이 와주셔서 감사해요. Hi everyone. I was just speaking to them in Korean. Happy that they're here on this rainy day. Hi. 안녕하세요. 웃으면서 얘기해도 돼요. 네. Shall we start? Thank you, Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, for visiting Iwa. It is my great pleasure to have you here. I think our students are very happy to have you here. I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. She has been named to this position in September 2019 and has served since October 1, 2019. She was born in Sofia, Bulgaria, and she holds a PhD in economic science and a master's in political economy and sociology from the University of National and World Economy, also from Sofia, Bulgaria, where she was also an associate professor between 1977 and 1993. She then began her career in public service at the World Bank as an environmental economist. She served in the European Union as the European Commission Vice President for Budget and Human Resources. In this capacity, she oversaw the EU's 161 billion euros, or in US dollars, $175 billion. Isn't that great? It's a big budget. And 33,000 staff members, as well as the EU's response to the euro area debt crisis and the 2015 refugee crisis. Before joining the IMF, she was the CEO of the World Bank from January 2017 to September 2019, during which time she also served as interim president of the World Bank Group for 3 months. Now, if I was going to read all of her distinguished career, we won't have time for this fireside chat. So let me just get started. Is that okay? Okay. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know when you started your tenure at IMF, you had to deal with the COVID-19 crisis right after you began. Then the war in Ukraine began, and now the Middle East is also embroiled in war. Before all of this, before all this began, how did you decide to become or major in economics and sociology? What experience or factors in your youth drew you to this field?
Well, wonderful to be with all the students here. I just got a quick course on the history of the university and where the university is headed. And I can tell you, I envy you. You have great opportunity, great time to be here. I was very fortunate to grow in Bulgaria in a loving family. My mother and my father were ordinary people. We didn't have a lot of means. We actually lived through some scarcity and difficulties, but whenever I would go home, I would be with these wonderful people, my parents, in the most difficult moments of their lives. They will sing together. And that had a tremendous impact on how I grew up, to be positive, to see and seek and see always the best in people. And it is also what led me to be very interested in what makes societies work. I got early, in 8th grade at school, very curious about philosophy. And I would read Kant and Spinoza and try to figure out how we define who we are as societies. And that took me later on to study political economy and sociology, and then to become a professor focusing on political economy of capitalism. Why? Because I lived in these years in a centrally planned economy. How many of you know how North Korea functions? North Korea? What is the economy of North Korea? Do you know? Oh, come on, so of course you know. It is a command and control economy. Decisions are made by the top leadership, and people have to cope with these decisions. That was not in that extreme as North Korea, but that was the economy I was living in, and it was not well-functioning economy. The result of this centralized decision-making was scarcity of goods, queues for virtually everything. I still remember getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to queue to buy milk for my daughter. And that raised interest in, is there an alternative? And that is why I studied market economies. I was very fortunate to go to London School of Economics in the late 80s and to see how a well-organized society and economy can make it easier for people, ordinary people, to live their lives. This is how I came to political economy and sociology, and I would tell you that my next decision was equally significant, and it was to do my PhD on environmental policy. Why did I go for environment? Because I realized that not taking care of our environment has dramatically negative consequences in terms of pollution, its impact on health, in terms of well-being of people. So all these choices later on got me to the World Bank and helped me tremendously when I became managing director and we were hit by COVID. I would be very interested how you got to be interested in sociology. What was your path to sociology?
I was a student at Iwa in the late 1970s, and many of you, our students, were not born in the 70s, so let me tell you what happened in the late 1970s. Late 1970s, we were still using a lot of textbooks that were written in the UK or the United States, and we were reading about capitalism and democracy, and they were often saying, if there is capitalist development, then democracy comes. They come hand in hand. But in Korea, what was happening is there was very rapid economic growth, economic development, but it felt like democracy was going backwards. So the relationship that seemed almost automatic in the West, it was opposite. And I was trying to go to graduate school, but my family was not in a good shape to help me go to graduate school in Korea. But I found out that there were scholarship opportunities in the United States. So I decided maybe I go for a scholarship in the United States because I couldn't go to graduate school in Korea at the time. So I said, why not? So I started studying, and then I wrote my study plan, and I said, your textbooks tell me that capitalist development leads to democracy. Well, my country is going the opposite. Your textbooks must be wrong. So prove to me that you're right, or maybe we do research together to say that our case, there must be a way to explain this. So I got a scholarship. So they said, come here, let's study this together. And I found later that my professor was indeed trying to understand East Asia's rapid economic development, so I got a scholarship. So I started looking at the political economy of development, how the government was very much in control of our country's national development, but also that heavy hand in the economy also meant a heavy hand in the political sector, controlling the political rights of people. So that's how I got interested. But when I came back to Korea in the late 1990s, that was the time when Korea was transitioning to become a donor of development, a donor in development cooperation. So my research area shifted from development aid recipient to an aid donor. So my research focus was from third world development, the disjuncture between democracy and development, to how to be a good donor and to sustainable development. So my world has changed a little bit. And the other sort of impetus for my research has come from my students. What do my students tell me that they want to study? So they told me what they're interested in. So I started doing research on disaster relief and so on, because that's what they wanted to do, and that's what they wanted research grants for. So I started writing research grants to get them research grants, and they started doing research with me. So my research trajectory sometimes went in unexpected ways, not because I was bright, but because my student told me that's where they wanted to do research, and I sort of started exploring new areas. So sometimes I was very directive, sometimes I was sort of following where my students told me they wanted to do.
Yep. Well, that is very interesting. My story is very similar in that regard, that I would look at what is driving changes in the world, and then my interest and my writing and my publications will change over time.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Let's go back to when you started at IMF. When I started introducing you, when you started at IMF in 2019, you probably didn't know that the COVID-19 was coming. October 19, you started your job calmly as possible at IMF, and boom, COVID-19 strikes you, the world. What happened?
My first speech when I became managing director at the annual meetings of the World Bank and IMF was in October 2019. And at that time, I was talking about low productivity, low growth, social unrest in many countries, and a looming climate crisis. So that was the consideration at that time. And 3 months later, the world came to a complete halt because of COVID. I very vividly remember meeting with my staff to experiment how we can work all from home just for one day. And the day was Friday. On Saturday, I called my team and I said, this is not going to be a simple, fast to evaporate problem. On Monday, we all moved to work from home. And at that time, our concentration was, one, to understand what are the economic implications of COVID? What is going to happen? That has never been experienced before. And secondly, what can we do to help our membership. So very quickly, we called on the ministers of finance of our membership, on our central bank governors, to diagnose the problem. And I'm very proud that we came up with the right diagnostics. It was simultaneously a supply and demand side shock. Why? Because we stopped producing, supplies are not coming anymore, and we stopped going out to shops and restaurants. We stopped consuming in the traditional way. What are the consequences? Well, the consequences are no income. No income for the governments, no income for enterprises, no income for people. And therefore, we at the IMF immediately decided that we have to rapidly provide liquidity support to our members. We, within 1 week after WHO announced the pandemic, disbursed our first emergency financing. It was for the Kyrgyz Republic, I still remember that. And over the next weeks, we provided emergency financing to the largest number of countries in such a short period of time. And then we did one more thing. We said, we as an institution can create liquidity and reserves. The IMF has this magic of producing, we call it special drawing rights. What it is the equivalent of money, and we decided to issue $650 billion of special drawing rights distributed across our membership. So in a short while, we injected the equivalent of $1 trillion in the world economy, and that played a hugely important role, especially for low-income countries, for countries with weak capacity to help their own people. I still vividly remember when people ask me, what are your recollections from these times? One is getting a call from the president of Ghana. We just disbursed $1 billion in emergency financing to Ghana. It was 2 o'clock in the morning for him when he got the news from Washington. And so he calls me and says, look, I just want to thank you, thank the IMF. You have no idea how vital this $1 billion is for us. It virtually makes the difference between life and death for people that were hit the hardest by the COVID pandemic. So when I reflect on this period of COVID, I would sum up and of course then we had the war in Ukraine, another shock. Then we had cost of living crisis, another shock. My reflection is twofold. First, we are living in a more shock-prone world. These kinds of shocks, especially with the climate crisis, unfortunately are going to be coming more often and less expected. Right. So we have to adapt to that new world. This is the new normal. And we have to embrace building resilience to these shocks. Number two, solidarity matters. We have to recognize that within our countries and across the globe, there are people and businesses that are most severely impacted, they are most vulnerable. And we have to have the capacity to help people, help communities to go through these periods of time without devastation. it has translated for us at the IMF in reflecting quite seriously on what does it mean to build resilience for a more shock-prone world. And we came up with something that is fairly kind of simple and straightforward. We need resilient people, educated, healthy, and with good social protection when a shock hits. We need resilient societies, not just resilient economies. Obviously, we need resilient economies that have sound fundamentals, where people pay taxes and the government makes good use of this money. But also we need societies that are paying attention to equality, where there is a sense of fairness. And 3, we need a resilient planet. We have to take really to heart that we have not been very good stewards of the planet that we don't own. We just are, guardians of it for the next generation. And that philosophy of policies for people today and for the next generations is the most important lesson I learned from the last years. And I'm actually, you became president in 2021, right. In the midst of COVID. So how did you cope?
Well, I became president, so running for president during COVID was a challenge. I had a follow-up, but maybe I answered this question and I do a follow-up. For me, it was a blessing in disguise for my personal character, and if I confess this, people won't believe me. I'm an introvert. It's hard for people to believe. So I'm an introvert in nature, so for me to meet large groups of people and immediately engage is not always easy. So during COVID, for me to do the election campaign, I was meeting one-on-one. So that was easier for me to do, being an introvert. The second thing, when I was finally elected, I took the COVID period, I tried to see if there's anything, is there a silver lining in the COVID period as a university? And I understood that the silver lining for the university is the students are not here. Many of the staff, professors are not here at the university. So it meant that we had a unique opportunity to take stock of our infrastructure. Is there anything that we needed to upgrade, refurbish during the COVID period? So it was the first time in the university's history to do a ICT master planning. So we did the ICT master plan and did a complete overhaul of our ICT system. We knew when COVID was over that when the students were back on campus, the online teaching would not go away. The online teaching would be here to stay. So we had to refurbish the ICT system. So we did an overhaul of the ICT. So we tried to understand what was the silver line, what is something that we could take advantage of. We also got prepared to do a COVID testing station on campus. We were the only university that did the on-campus testing. I was so afraid when the students are back on campus. We have 25,000 students. It's a fairly large physical space of the campus is fairly large. About 25% of our students are in our student housing. It's one of the largest among the private university. We have the largest student on-campus facility. So I had to get a way to have the students tested. I was visiting Stanford University and other universities in the United States, and they were testing the students twice a week for free. there was no way I could do it with the cost. It was about 25억 won. How much is that in US dollars? It was, what? $2 million per week. Huh? An incredible amount of money. Huge amount of money. So I couldn't do that. So every time I met the Minister of Education, I said, when we get the students back on campus, there has to be a way to bring them back safely. But they had no remedies ready for that. But suddenly they said, starting from spring 2022, students should be back on campus, and the universities have to be ready. But we were in discussion with a testing company as of November 2021, and they were giving us a small scholarship, and I got overjoyed that day. And can you put a testing station on our campus? And the president said, sure. And I was overjoyed. Later, he confessed that he was doing a testing station for 1 month. But I was overjoyed because I said, until the end of COVID. So my vice president did a post-agreement and did a 6 months, but I got them to do it for 1 year. I remember we had a very nicely decorated green testing station on campus, so they did a donation. I think it was worth 60억 won, 6 billion Korean won worth of testing. So I got the testing station only at Iwa, so our students were very happy, and we had a very safe campus. But once the other thing that I did is we wanted to make sure that we had a very strong plan for the fourth industrialization era. We were very mindful of the gender gap and the digital gap of the fourth industrialization era, and also sustainable development. So we wanted to make sure that in the Iwa tradition of strong humanities and social sciences, we also had to get going with the STEM AI fields that were going to be critical for our students and women to survive and take hold of this digital transformation era. So we introduced new measures. We introduced customized online, offline, hybrid education, and so on. So we introduced some pretty new measures, AI college, semiconductor. We are the only university that has climate change and renewable energy department, and so on. So we did some new things, and we keep fighting the stereotype about what women students want and like to do. And I said, and they said, and I kept hearing that our students are interested in startups. And I kept hearing from these other people outside the university or others saying, oh, women are not interested in startups. And I said, but our students said they want to. So we opened courses. From 1,000, in 1 year, it went to 2,500. And we got a big grant from the Seoul Metropolitan Government. So we converted some facilities at the university for a startup space, and it just blossomed. So we're doing some nifty things for our students. Yes. And now, back to you. So 2024 is around the corner. And a follow-up to your question, to your answer about what IMF did in the COVID crisis. Mm-hmm. Now, IMF, you have sort of a division of labor vis-a-vis the World Bank. The World Bank is interested in long-term development of developing countries in particular. IMF does short-term rescue. Mm-hmm. The pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, you have to do a lot of short-term rescue. But unfortunately, unlike other times when the debt crisis hits one or two countries or region, the pandemic this time hit every country in the world. Mm-hmm. There was no country that was exempt from the COVID-19 pandemic. Developed countries, developing countries, everyone, every country was hit. And we, as you have rightly said, we expect another pandemic to hit us pretty soon, and it would also hit all countries. The way that we're interconnected, it's going to hit us inevitably in a new way, in a more dramatic way, quicker than we think. And that's why you say resilience at all levels is going to be critical, that we have to be ready and we have to be united and have a very well-aligned international system. Many of us outside of the international organizations were very skeptical of whether the international governance was alive and well. We worry, is the IMF going to be strong enough, resilient enough, if there are so many customers who need your help?
Well, first I want to reflect on something that you said in the previous rank, which was you're an introvert. I'm not. So I actually get positive energy from interacting with people, and I certainly need it in my job. To go to the heart of your question, how are we going to deal with more sudden shocks? It may be pandemic, it may be a climate disaster, it may be another war that spills over and affects other countries. Unless we work together, unless we keep humanity aligned, we are going to be weaker in this world of more frequent shocks. And yet, what we have seen over the last years is a more fragmented world. What does it mean? Does it mean that we surrender and we go into a world of separate camps, very much like the world I grew up in, the Cold War world? Or we persevere to work to bring the world together? I very strongly believe that our destiny is to persevere and work very hard to identify those areas where we can work together and where we must work together because individually we will fail. Take climate change. Well, Korea can reduce emissions to 0, but if the rest of the world continues to emit more and more, it doesn't really matter what you have done here. So, or take the issue of debt. If we don't cooperate, there cannot be debt resolution for countries that are overburdened by debt. So, in our organization, what we do is to relentlessly work to keep our membership. We have 190 members, to keep the membership together. How do we do that? First, by being very clear about our role in this more shock-prone world. We are the lender of last resort for countries in trouble. And the number of these countries has gone up, not down. So we must be financially strong. And here is something that I want to share with you that gives me that sense that when you drive collaboration, when you persevere, it happens. We just received the support of our members to increase by 50% the quotas of the IMF. This is the equivalent of about $320 billion of lending capacity at a time when it is difficult to reach agreements. We have done it. We did it in Marrakesh during our annual meetings, and it is now known as the Marrakesh Miracle. We also recognize that countries that are weaker, poorer countries, they need more help on the basis of zero interest lending. So we advocated, and our members came through to give us subsidy so we can lend to low-income countries, increase our capacities to stand by them when they are in trouble. And the most amazing thing is that the number of donors, Korea is among the donors, but the number of donors has increased. We now have some middle-income countries like Indonesia, some small countries, Trinidad and Tobago, my own country, Bulgaria, that have never been donors. The Middle East, never been donors, they have now joined. And that expanding solidarity comes by being good in what we do, stand by the members in need. And finally, one thing that we have never done in the history of the IMF is to recognize that today's and tomorrow's challenges require massive structural transformation to make the economies greener and more sustainable. But that means helping countries to have macroeconomic stability because they're more resilient to climate shocks. Cannot be done with the traditional short-term loans of the IMF. So we created for the first time in the history of the IMF a long-term structural support instrument called Resilient and Sustainability Trust, so we can lend on longer terms with longer maturity, longer grace period, concessional interest rate, and we put a target to get 40 billion in this trust. We are now at 42 billion. Wow. So goodness, here is my philosophy. I actually believe that the vast majority of people on this planet are good people. They actually care about the communities they live in, the countries they live in, the world they live in. The problem is that hate and anger are very loud, whereas goodness and care, they don't scream. So we have a big problem to amplify these voices of goodness. And when we do it, good things happen. And our Marrakesh Miracle is an evidence of that. I want to ask a question to the audience. Now, be honest. Yes. Are you... So I'm going to first ask the angry people. How many of you are mostly angry most of the time? Raise your hand. Mostly angry most of the time. How many of you are mostly kind of happy most of the time? Mostly in good mood most of the time? Let me see. Well, so here we go. And I would raise my hand too. So we have really, as humanity, we have a very important job to translate this into a louder, stronger message and kind of be happy together.
That's great. Let's give her a big hand for this. I think this is a good segue to some questions from our students. I understand that there are a lot of student interest in asking some questions. Could I get some hands from the students who wanted to ask questions? 학생들 질문 좀 하고 싶다고 그랬는데 질문 좀 받을까요? 네. 앞줄 중앙 통로 가까이 있는 학생? 네. 질문해 주시겠어요?
My name is Taeyeon Hwang, and I'm senior in Iwa University. And first of all, thank you for coming here. I I would like to ask about the CBDC and the cryptocurrencies. These days, cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoins are gaining popularity, and companies like Facebook are creating their own currency. So I believe this has raised concern about the implications caused to traditional monetary policies and banking systems in the future. So what changes do you personally anticipate, and what measures are the IMF taking to prepare for such changes?
Thank you very much for this question. Straight into our alley. After all, we are the International Monetary Fund. Let me respond in the following way. First, digitalization is transforming the way we live, the way we work, and of course it is impacting the world of money. This is a one-way street. We are not going to go back to a place where we all carry cash in our pockets and cash is king. So we have to embrace digitalization when it comes down to monetary transactions. Second, we have to recognize that there is a huge difference between digital money created by central banks, central bank digital currencies, and digital monies created by the private sector. In the first category, central bank digital currencies, today 90% of central banks are looking into it at different degree of engagement and advancement. We already have 19 countries that are either already piloting on scale or are using central bank digital currencies. And then we have many countries in a first stage of piloting. Korea is also piloting CBDCs. And in this world of CBDCs, there are two ways to go about them. One is the so-called wholesale, in which the central bank creates CBDCs but does not offer them to the public. It is just the way in which central banks can interact, but they are not turning into banks. And the second one is retail CBDCs, when actually people can hold CBDCs and move away from banking in the traditional bank's sense. How countries would go about it is to be seen. Some will go retail, some would go wholesale. Some would say, well, this is not yet for me. I'm going to rely on, which is also digital, on the traditional banking. On the private sector side, it's a much more complicated story, because there are stable coins that are fully backed by assets. And in that sense, they actually do play a role in a manner that is more responsible. Stable coins, however, are a minority. Majority of what we see are unbacked, poorly backed, not very stable, volatile, speculative, and that world is expanding quite rapidly, creating financial stability risks. Let me say it as clearly as I can. It may be called coin, but it is not money. It is a risky asset, investment asset, something like a money market fund you invest in. And I have been saying that many, many times. I can take this bottle, and I can say, I'm going to use this bottle as mean of exchange. I'll give you the bottle, you give me something else. Does it make it money? No, because it doesn't store value very well. It's not really easy to carry around. So when we think about money, we need to recognize there are requirements that define what is money. Stores value, is easy to transact, low cost to transact. And when we talk about central banks, they provide this finality of transaction and security of transaction. So, a lot to do. And our focus at the IMF is on the side of CBDCs. How can we ensure interoperability? So when different countries create central bank digital currencies, they still can interact, even if they are done differently. And in the world of crypto, privately issued assets, the most important task is regulation. There has to be clear legal framework, transparency, so you know what you're dealing with, and a way to keep all these issuers accountable. Otherwise, we risk to get more trouble. Okay, so you ask, I'm given a sign that we have 5 minutes, and you ask me a question that I can talk 5 hours on. So let me just wrap it up and say there are great opportunities with digitalization, but there are also great risks. And we at the IMF concentrate on both, how to capture the opportunities, create common digital platforms, but also how to manage the risks. Thank you for the 5-minute alert.
I think she reads Korean. Yeah. I think I'm going to take just one more question and then try to wrap up. Where's the microphone? One more question. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Emma Lee, and I'm also a senior student in I화여대 Women's University. And I would first say that I would really appreciate you coming and sharing your experience, especially during the COVID situation. So I believe it's crucial to address the geopolitical challenges we currently face, like notably China's BRI and its global economic implications. And the rise of China as a predominant development credit provider. And this raises a substantial concerns, such as the lack of transparency and also long-term, disclosed long-term loan terms. And this continues to burden economic vulnerable nations and with unsustainable debt and also increasing their economic dependency on China. And I believe this will potentially expose them to undue political influence. So my question is that I'd like to know how the IMF plans to handle these changes in the world's economy, especially in China's BRI. And also I'm interested in how the IMF aims to take on a stronger leadership role globally in the long term.
Great question. The changes in the world economy over the last decades are quite dramatic. We have seen emerging markets, not just China, but countries like Brazil, actually Korea, the countries in the ASEAN, dynamic economies that have grown quite significantly, and among them, of course, China is the largest emerging market economy. As such, with more wealth in China comes more responsibility. China needs to recognize that its role in the world has to be one of responsible global player. Over the last decades, China has provided very significant amounts of financing to developing countries. And not only there is significant amount of financing, but it comes from multiplicity of Chinese institutions. China Development Bank, Exim Bank, state-owned enterprises. So what China found itself is that as it has expanded its presence, it also needs to improve domestically coordination of its own engagement in the developing world. It has taken some time, but finally today, Ministry of Finance of China and People's Bank of China have been given this coordination mandate. Why does that matter? Because to put in place common standards for all Chinese lenders of transparency of contracts, disclosure in terms of what they are planning to do in the future, this is now more possible than it was 5 years ago and even 3 years ago. We've also engaged with China as a member of the IMF on this very issue of China's lending practices and China's participation in debt restructuring. We have engaged China as well as other new lenders like Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil. We have created a new global sovereign debt roundtable in which China participates together with the traditional lenders, the so-called Paris Club lenders, the private sector, which also expanded dramatically its presence in the developing world, but also with the borrowing countries themselves. So when we finally sit around the table where everybody is represented. Why does that matter? Because for China to act responsibly as a lender, China has to be convinced that the rules that apply, that we would like to see applied to China, they apply to everybody else. And that has taken some time for China to be convinced too. We have seen over the last year China gradually engaging more on debt restructuring. We had Chad, then Zambia, then Sri Lanka, then Ghana, and every case is quicker to move towards China participating with financial assurances because of this understanding that it is actually in China's own interest to be a transparent and reliable partner to countries. To put it very simply, if China doesn't participate, ultimately what is going to happen? Countries won't be able to pay China. So better participate and find a way forward in debt restructuring agreements. And I would say it is really, really important for the Chinese authorities to continue with that constructive engagement because if they are not doing it, ultimately the countries they engage with will find it more difficult to work with China. And we have also seen that, reflection. The Paris Club lenders, it took them quite some time to come to an agreement how to operate. We need the same for the new, so-called new lenders, and in particular for the large sources of finance like China, to happen faster. Why we need it to happen faster? So we can avoid bitter disappointments and countries falling off the cliff because of lack of action. And here, really, the IMF has been a very, very prominent force for engagement. And I can tell you, it's not an easy thing. It's easy when you have two lenders and the IMF calls them and says, hey, let's figure it out. Very difficult when you have dozens of lenders, private sector, countries. Have you guys ever tried to herd cats? Being cats together? So it's a little bit like this. But the cats are kind of getting better at that.
Great. You know, it's a pity that we don't have much time, but I would like to ask maybe your parting words for our students and our young people in this audience. What would you like to give them some words of wisdom as they prepare to lead the world for us in the future?
Well, to everybody in the room, the most important piece of advice I have for you is believe in yourself. You can do anything you decide to do. You just look at me. I grew up under communism. If anybody was to tell me in my youth that one day I would be the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, I would have laughed. But here I am. Somebody in this audience could be in my position or in other position of leadership and authority. That would only happen if you believe it can happen. So, very best of luck to all of you. You are fantastic.
Well, thank you very much for coming to Ewha Women's University. It's such an honor and pleasure. And I hope this is not your last visit. I would love to have you come back. And I wish you a very nice holiday and a great new year. Apparently next year is the year of the Blue Dragon. A great new year to all of you. Thank you very much.
저기 학생들한테 잠시 안내 말씀드리겠습니다. 지금 여기 IMF 총재께서 저 여러분들과 함께 지금 사진 촬영을 하시기를 원하세요. 그러니까 여러분들께서 약간 이쪽 이 가운데 쪽으로 좀 이렇게 몰려주시고 우리 총재님께서 총장님이랑 총재님 가운데 서시고 학생들을 대상으로 이제 사진 촬영 잠시 하도록 하겠습니다. 이쪽으로 이쪽으로 보시면 됩니다. 턴어라운드 하시면 됩니다. 두 분 좀 더 친절. 네, 감사합니다. 학생들 좀 착석 부탁드리겠습니다.